This is something that I'm really excited about, the intersection of social justice and racial equity, housing sufficient to house our population, and working on the affordability problem, and environmental and resource sustainability. So I am really thrilled to introduce these guys and gal. I am going to give you a little bit about our panelists. Bao Pham, if you would wave, Bao. Bao Pham is a Vietnamese American architect and design consultant currently practicing in Orange County. A Santa Ana resident, Bao takes great joy in working on projects of all scales and types in a city and country that warmly welcomed his family when they immigrated to America over 25 years ago. Bao is a firm believer in the power of thoughtful and well-designed built environment. Whether it's housing or the environment, his belief that an open and healthy discussion of these topics will not only lead to a more engaged and informed community, will lead to a more engaged and informed community. Bao currently serves as a planning commissioner in the city of Santa Ana. Thank you, Bao. Melanie Schlotterbeck has focused on quality of life issues for over 20 years. Her work with Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks aims to create parks that allow for recreational opportunities while also protecting habitat for wildlife. She has united more than 80 nonprofits in community groups to create a conservation vision for Orange County called the Green Vision Map, which you can Google. Over the last decade, she has worked to balance the need for urban and wilderness parks, housing, and transportation. She is currently the chair of the Brea Planning Commission. And I would like to say that I met Melanie through a mutual friend, but then also we ended up being jurors for the SCAG Sustainability Award. So I have gotten to serve with her as well. Manny Muñoz is a passionate planner who cares about improving the quality of life of the community and showing K-12 students the profession of urban planning. He strongly believes that housing should be equitable and sustainable, the key to improving the quality of life for any community. Currently, he's the planning manager for the city of Azusa. He lives in La Habra and serves on the La Habra Beautification Committee and is the vice chair for the La Habra Planning Commission and is president of Cal Poly Pomona's Urban and Regional Planning Alumni Chapter. Our moderator this evening is Jason Killebrew, who is, Jason was born in Los Angeles and raised in the Pasadena area. He graduated from Cal State Fullerton in 2007 and has worked as a professional planner in the communities of Santa Clarita, Pasadena, Riverside, Eastvale, and most recently, he is the current planning manager for the city of Brea. He looks broader than zoning. He looks at projects broader than just the general plan or the zoning code to identify how projects can deliver economic prosperity and community benefits to the city. He enjoys spending time with his wife and 2 daughters and his 2 boxers, Rufus and Hook, which I think are great names for your pets. And so with that, I am going to say, I'm going to turn it over to Jason, who's our moderator. I'm going to thank you for your time and your attendance. And I am going to work on my Facebook profile.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth. So panelists, you guys kind of ready to go? We're good? Okay. So just for the audience, there's a couple of different topics we'll bounce around, but those topics, just so you guys know, are related to housing equity, sustainability, which is, why we're all here today. So I'm going to just kind of jump into it with an opening question, and I'm going to lead it off with Melanie. What do you need to be equitable, sensitive to the environment, and meet housing needs?
So I'll start with good question. I think that no one topic, whether it's housing, the environment, or equity, needs to win the day. There needs to be a way to practice finding the and, so that the scenario that's set up in policy and implementation doesn't limit you to an either or scenario. We can have houses, we can have the equity and affordable units provided, and we can have green spaces protected. And I think, there's this thought that that it's okay to develop in green fields and add essential infrastructure out there. But the reality is, with the state laws that are in place, it costs a lot more. It costs more for the environment. It costs more for taxpayers, clean air, clean water. we need to retain those green spaces. And I think the pandemic proved their importance. And ultimately, if people are placed near jobs and we have a focus on those locations in city-centered walkable areas, that will do better kind of across the board.
Awesome. Manny, what do you think we need to do to be equitable, sensitive to the environment, and meet housing needs?
I think Melanie hit it right on the spot that we have to look at the three equally and work towards having solutions for all three. I think a lot of the times we get hung up on saying, well, we're getting housing, but we're not doing this, but at least we're doing this. And I think it's very important in looking at all three as one versus seeing them as a singular item and being happy or having a community be content. Well, at least we got a housing project, or at least we saved this, or at least, we were able to get, 5 affordable units and so forth, and champion for all three equally.
Awesome, thanks, Manny. Bao, so just thinking about those topics, who do you think needs to be at the table when it comes to making decisions as it relates to, finding ways to be equitable, sensitive to the environment, and also meet, the housing need that we all know exists?
Thanks, Jason. I think in general, I think that people who should be at the table should represent the communities that are being addressed. And so, like most things, we talk about Orange County in general, but Orange County is a variety of cities as well as a variety of demographics in it. And so my thought is, when it comes to equity, housing, and environment, we should invite those who are directly impacted by these issues, whether or not they have the specialty or they're kind of like whether or not they have the verbiage to describe the issue, but their lived experience and their day-to-day lives also inform us with a certain kind of data that I think is definitely useful when we address these type of issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Melanie, just kind of piggyback, you talked about the and why that's a very strong word when you're talking about all of those different components and topics. What policies and programs or tools or examples that you've seen that have been successful elsewhere, keeping those kind of topics in mind?
Yeah, and I think this kind of ties into all of them in their own special way. So for example, you heard in the introduction of Friends of Harbors, Beaches and Parks Green Vision Map, which is on the wall here next to me. And I did notice Jean Watt, who's one of the founders of FHBP, in the attendee list. So I'm giving a shout out to Jean for literally walking around to environmental nonprofits throughout the county more than 20 years ago to get the high priority conservation lands on the map. And so that basically helps direct where appropriate development could go. So that's one example. Another example that's actually being undertaken right now by SCAG is a green print that will help developers, transportation agencies, planners, consultants, et cetera, understand the lay of the land. And that tool will be hopefully coming live by the end of the year. And so I'll pop some links into the chat and folks can see some of these things that I'm talking about. But another example that links transportation and the environment is the Orange County Transportation Authority's Environmental Mitigation Program, which basically sets aside land and restores land in permanent conservation status and simultaneously allows for the expansion of freeway projects. So that's the and there. If you're talking about housing, a couple examples, Martis Valley up in the Tahoe area, There's a transfer fee that's imposed on specific developments that helps build affordable housing through funding there and preserve the environment. For example, on Brea, since I'm quite familiar with the city, there's a hillside management ordinance that focuses on what is and isn't allowed in those sensitive locations. So those are a couple of the examples. And like I said, I'll post some information in the chat.
Awesome, thanks, Melanie. So speaking, I'm going to kind of use Brea too, because I'm a little familiar with Brea as well. And so, we do have those sensitive areas and the hillside open space. And so, when areas of like that are intended to be preserved and conserved, it means that development has to happen elsewhere. And so, what do you really think is at the heart of Nimbyism?
I think it's partially it's a miscommunication. I think it's most people's knee-jerk reaction. They like things the status quo. If I bought my property as is, I want it to remain as is till the day that I relinquish that site. And so I think it's I think it's something that we I think something it's natural, but I also think it stems from a miscommunication that when people think about not wanting new projects, new development that intrudes into their neighborhood, they think of the worst case scenario. Oh no, what if there's so much more traffic into my neighborhood? What if there are a increasing amount of population into this neighborhood? But I think that a strong kind of communication between those who are involved in the developments or in any project with the constituents who live in these specific neighborhoods. I think a lot of the Nimbyism attitude could be addressed just in terms of clear communication that it's not as bad as you think it is.
Awesome. Manny, what do you think?
So I think Melanie and Bopao mentioned as far as policy and status quo. So I feel there's very few cities that are innovative in their policies. And the ones that are innovative, yeah, they're moving the needle, they're kind of moving forward. But the ones that aren't are just contributing towards Nimbyism because it's status quo. People don't know anything else. They don't know innovative policies. They don't know different housing stocks, different policies to preserve green space or being more sustainable in that sense. So, I mean, it's not going to change from one day to the next, but at least incrementally seeing that change and having more innovative policies that will tackle directly into Nimbyism and showcasing ultimately a different lifestyle, a different approach in how people live. Because, I mean, in Southern California, we're so car-centric and we're so suburban and single-family home and so forth. And obviously it has to change since we do have a housing crisis to just really introduce a different type of lifestyle to Southern California, specifically Orange County, since, this is.
Yeah. Thanks, Manny. Melanie, what do you think? Nimbyism.
I'm going to take a slightly different approach just because of my background. I actually think that the true definition of not in my backyard has actually morphed in time. We have a more intelligent populace. They're more participatory and they're more informed about the public process. And I'll use an example in the hills above Yorba Linda, where there's a project proposed for 340 homes, steep slopes, wildfire prone, it's burned multiple times. And I think we all can know and admit that affordable housing doesn't go on steep slopes. The math just doesn't pencil out. And so there's a red herring argument that housing is important, but the type of housing being proposed on hillsides, specifically these, is not going to contribute in the way that we need it to contribute. And I do think that decision makers kind of at all levels, both the Planning Commission, City Council, and the Board of Supervisors are confusing passionate, informed, engaged dialogue with emotion. And if you look specifically at that Esperanza Hills property, it's burned multiple times. And in the freeway complex fire specifically, the existing residents could not get out of their neighborhoods. So the streets were not wide enough. And if you're adding 340 multi-million-dollar homes, the reality is those homes are going to have multiple cars, and they're going to have to go up and down a winding road with multiple hairpin turns, with steep elevation changes. And it's going to contribute to the loss of life and the loss of property. And so residents are coming at this from really personal and intimate knowledge of the landscape. And I think that's often not heard. What is heard is the no, we don't think this is safe. When in reality, solutions have been presented, especially on that Esperanza Hills project, for multiple exits and a reduced density and putting it in a safer location. But all people hear is the no, not the no, but you can do this. And so I think as decision makers, we all need to do a better job of listening for the heart of the argument and understanding that folks that are coming to the table with this information have experienced something profound in their life, and they don't want other people to go through it themselves.
So you spoke a little bit about emotion, and all of us have emotion, and especially when you're in a you're in a, say, a homegrown situation. So that kind of goes to Manny's point about the status quo, and you're used to, you grew up here, you're used to it looking a certain way, and as soon as that changes, then there's that uncomfortableness that sometimes leads to a NIMBY situation. But all three of you are decision makers, and so how do you sometimes, when you're on the dais and you're presented, a project, or you're presented an ordinance or a policy, how do you separate that emotional element from it in your decision making or in your policy making? I'll start with Manny.
I mean, ultimately, you have to kind of look at the bigger picture, and then see where that policy falls into the bigger picture, and then seeing how policies and procedures are going to work out in getting to that ultimate goal. So, for example, in La Habra, we recently had a inclusionary housing ordinance that was passed, and so forth. So, it might not be comprehensive or that's going to solve everything, but it's one aspect of it, and having a different solution, having more like a toolkit, so to speak, to be able to undertake just housing in general. So kind of looking at it from that lens, at least that's how I look at now that I'm on the dais side and making the decisions versus just recommending stuff.
Val, how do you gauge the two?
I tend to agree with Manny. I think that sometimes we all need to kind of take a step back, because you dive too deep into the minute details of things. We tend to lose sight of the larger purpose of if we were to use the example of an ordinance, that sometimes it's not gonna please everyone at the table, but if everyone at the table agrees that these specific ordinance or whatever issue that's at the table, it helps gives a building block for a kind of a larger picture. Whereas a specific ordinance might not satisfy certain constituents, certain groups, but it enables the city staff to be able to kind of use it to propel kind of their vision of the city in the next 10, 15 years. Then sometimes I think as commissioners, as any decision makers, we need to kind of take it upon ourselves to, of course, listen to our residents, but also take a step back and see that maybe certain things our residents might not agree with, but it might enable the city to accommodate their needs in the future.
That's good. It makes me think to, like, you're all planning commissioners and and you just spoke to kind of, addressing the needs and hearing the needs. But how do we get, Southern California, Orange County, is a very diverse population set. And so how do we get that information out to be as equitable as possible for both receiving that information and then the opportunity to comment or address that information? How do we, especially coming out of COVID, like, what are some of the things that you guys have experienced as being successful or unsuccessful in the use of technology or translation or things of that nature, to make it more equitable for people to have an opportunity in a space to participate, and to your point, Val, to actually communicate what those needs are. What do you think, Melanie?
Yeah, I think engagement with the public at the earliest opportunity is absolutely critical. And by that, I will be very specific. I do not mean during the CEQA public comments, whether it's the NOP or the EIR. It needs to be before the project has gotten to that stage, because by the time you're spending money on an environmental document, the project's really pretty much set in stone. And doing substantive changes after that are cost prohibitive to a developer. And so sitting down, and this goes back to the question earlier about who needs to be invited to the table, anyone and everyone. So you need to go through as a city or a county and see who's commented on projects or policies in the past. You need to employ as many outreach opportunities as possible. Brea has had really good visioning processes, whether it's the Brea Envisions or Shape Brea, focusing right now on our housing element. So social media, all the different channels there, and then making sure that it's being held at times that people can participate, that we're taking into consideration childcare issues or transportation issues or health issues. Not everyone can meet in person still. So I think casting as wide a net as possible is important.
Great, Manny, what do you think? How do we make things equitable and increase participation?
I think first, cities have to honestly be honest with themselves and want to do outreach, and not just check a box and say, hey, we've had 2 meetings and so forth, and let that conversation be a conversation. Like Melanie said, start it soon, and more importantly, be consistent throughout the entire process. The big thing that I've seen in community outreach, it's twofold. It's one, you're doing outreach, but second, you're also, a lot of the times you're doing education in whatever the manner is, if it's housing, if it's sustainability, if it's open space or whatnot, because a lot of people don't understand these type of concepts because they're so much more technical. So kind of linking both as far as outreach and educating the community as far as what is important for the community. And by having a comprehensive outreach toolkit or a comprehensive outreach plan that does include, like Melanie stated, certain avenues of getting to people. The other big thing is translation services and so forth. Looking at your demographics, looking at your community, seeing what works. Also being more innovative in how we get the information. For example, now we're going on to Facebook here in this platform. A lot of people have Facebook, some people have Instagram and stuff like that, and seeing how we can tap in to those forms of platforms versus Zoom and whatnot. The good thing about COVID is that it pushed a lot of municipalities to go virtual. And I think moving forward, it should be more of a staple where, yeah, you have your in-person events that are complemented with the virtual platform. That way you have that wide net and you're getting all of the participants that can participate. And just always having, and my biggest thing too is have a conversation versus that meeting setting that, because ultimately people are uncomfortable and when they want to speak freely, you still have to obviously tailor it and kind of structure it to a certain extent, but just looking at our outreach efforts and how we ultimately get that information, that buy-in, and that commentary.
That's great, man. You actually brought up a point there about education. You know, we're all planning professionals, and so we can speak, you know, a certain language that, you know, I remember my mom watched a meeting one time just to, you know, it was like my first meeting. She's like, I had no idea what you guys were talking about. And it, you know, it can be intimidating. We throw out CEQA like, you know, as an acronym so loosely. And a lot of times people are just like, you know, what is that? But something, you know, I think is part of that education. And Val, I'm gonna you know, have you lead off answering this question. But what do you think is the difference between density and overcrowding, and how is it sustainable or not sustainable?
Yeah, I think those two words sometimes they tend to be used interchangeably, and oftentimes they're used to kind of describe the worst case scenario, right? Um, uh, when we use density or overcrowding, we tend to think, you know, large amount of people in a small location or a small parcel of land. And for me, my perspective is sometimes I think which ties into the Nimbyism aspect of things is that sometimes people think they misinterpret density as overcrowding, and so when they see a multifamily complex or anything that's different from a single family residence, they think, oh no, this is getting too dense, it's going to get overcrowded. But my perspective is just as a general example, with you know, the increasing amount of ADUs that we've seen in the past year, an ADU in a typical 6,000 square foot lot, there's two houses, two habitable dwelling in one single parcel. To me, that's density. Whereas if you put that two separate family in a one single family house, to me, that's overcrowding. And so same parcel of land, same scenario, but I think density actually addresses a housing problem, whereas overcrowding promotes a housing problem. And so I think being clear about what is what and what is addressing what would really help the dialogue and would really help kind of bring the community together in terms of kind of how they want to address their housing issues moving forward.
Awesome. Manny, what do you think? What are the differences between density and overcrowding?
Yeah, I mean, Bao hit it on the nail. For example, I'm one prime example of it. Overcrowding. I have 3 generations in one house. I have my mom, I have my brother, his kids, and then myself. You know, and you know, looking forward, we are looking at EDUs, junior EDUs, and so forth, where we still want to be together but apart. You know, and seeing how density can be different in multi-generational families where, you know, a lot of us kind of stick together and stuff like that. This is key, and where you can still have the density in where you live, but you're still kind of together but still apart, and it's still it's increasing the overall density versus, you know, versus being in one house and ultimately, yeah, being overcrowded. And I think Santa Ana is like a prime example because of the demographics and so forth. You do have that overcrowding by, you know, just by cost of living, families, you know, they have no other choice. But then when you look at the density side of it, it's just like any other, you know, type of community. So it's, I mean, it's very important to see the difference and define both in a community.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys brought up a couple of topics, which is, I'll call it a hot topic here in California, and it's ADUs and JADUs, and, you know, mostly Southern California. Manny, you know, spoke about this earlier. It's so used to just being, you know, a single family, car-centric, freeway dependent type of culture. And so how does when we look at that, is that sustainable with the, you know, the housing crisis and, you know, air quality and like all of these different things when you start, you know, factoring these variables? Like how does culture and the generation that we're in fit with all of this? And I'll be a little bit more specific. Like, how do you feel, where, people say we're losing single family zoning or opportunities because you can do the ADU, or you're redeveloping, some of your center cores to go vertical, where it used to be like a 1 and 2 story environment. Melanie, how do you think the culture and generation, California culture and generation fits into that?
I think when people picture Southern California, it's single family houses and palm trees. And maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. That's what I picture when I think of California. But I don't know that that's actually accurate. I think we have such a diversity of mixed use and housing opportunities that have already been built, that that's just an inaccurate assumption. I think generationally, and this comes back to other comments that have been made, that you just kind of get comfortable with the way things have been. And I think if we're truly going to meet our affordable housing goals, and by affordable, I mean the very low and the low version, because we're doing fine in all the other ones. Most developers tend to promote housing that is market rate or above, that we need to be creative and we need to pull out all the stops, but with, I'll say this, within reason. So we're not sprawling, we're not continuing to promote car-centric behaviors, because housing isn't the only action that needs to be taken. We've got AB 32, which sets greenhouse gas emissions goals. We've got SB 375, which is a reduction of vehicle miles traveled. So how far our passenger cars are going from point to point. We've got the governor's executive order on 30 by 30, which is to protect 30% of California's lands and coastal waters by 2030. So we have to figure out a way to have it all. And I think the thing I personally struggle with on the ADU front is, I think there are certainly some lots where they're just not going to fit. Lot constraints are a big issue in some locations, but ultimately our infrastructure was built for specific numbers of cars and houses. And we may be allowing ADUs in specific locations because they fit, but nobody's talking about the infrastructure changes that need to happen that go along with that simultaneously. So one of my chief complaints is that we plan in silos. So, the fire agencies look at their stuff, police look at their stuff, planning looks at their stuff, everyone's separate. Nobody's zoomed out to the 11,000 foot level. And the last, I'll call it a gripe, is that there's no mechanism in place that requires ADUs be affordable. And so it seems to me that there's a perfect opportunity, if ADUs are allowed to be built in specific locations, that we do have incentives or programs that can make those affordable to the very low and low income levels.
That's great, Melanie. And no, you're right. There seems to be silos and a responsiveness. It doesn't feel proactive a lot of times. It just, we have to do this and this is that, and now we presented this opportunity and we really don't know what it's going to look like, a few years, 10 years from now. Val, how do you feel, culture and generational, those two components fit into that?
I think, based on my observation, I tend to like to take a walk on Saturdays along the Santa Ana River, near my house, and every now and then I see people gather out in front of their porch, kind of like impromptu neighbor meetings, each other discussing topics, this and that, and it just dawns on me. I think specific to Santa Ana, because there's a large populations, that are immigrants who come from other culture other than Southern California culture. That there is there's a stronger affinity for community, communal gatherings. There's a strong affinity for just, I think culturally, there is a stronger acceptance of density, not overcrowding, but density in terms of like what Manny said before, generational living accommodations, as well as specifically to the Vietnamese community. Oftentimes, people who immigrate from Vietnam to America, they'll tend to live with their closest relatives for the first 6 years to help build up a nest egg to be able to afford their own home and things like that. And so when I look at when I look at the housing issue in terms of culture, I think that I think there's an openness to density because it helps to assimilate, it helps to accommodate kind of financial and living situations that are out of the norm of that single family lot stereotype that we tend to think of, right? And so for me, again, I think every city is different. Every city has certain demographics, and so we should be more informed of our demographics, and then kind of tailor our policies to fit what's best for those residents.
Hey, you thanks, Bob. You brought up how you walk along like the river trail. I think that's what you're talking about. It's close to your house, and so that kind of sparked me, to think about like, well, what is the link between housing, conservation, equity, and then transportation? How people move about. Manny, what do you think?
I think that is the link out of all three, because I mean, we need to get to places ultimately. And I think especially in Orange County, I don't think that's a big enough issue here in Orange County when compared to like LA County, at least in the sense that LA County has a light rail. And Orange County, we don't have anything comprehensive that we're looking at it from a transportation issue. I'm like, great, we had our freeways and we expanded our freeways, but we never looked at just mass transportation as a whole. And I think if we're going to be looking at equity, sustainability, and housing, that transportation should be like the core foundation in how we're moving forward. Because yeah, we can build all this, we can conserve all this or whatnot, but if we're still going to be car dependent, I mean, it's not going to be that balanced approach. So I think regionally, that discussion should be a lot more important in all of our cities in Orange County.
What do you think, Melanie?
If you build the transportation infrastructure, they will come. And I think what we have seen is that I think it was the 210 freeway when it was constructed, they didn't expect it to reach capacity for quite a while, and it was within months. And so when we give people the opportunities to drive, they use it. I will say the pandemic has put a huge kink in transit ridership, bus ridership, whether it's affordability issues because people have taken a hit economically, or they're just not feeling safe, whatever their reason happens to be. I know that the ridership is not up to where it was pre-pandemic. But the more options we have to not be dependent on cars, I think the better it is for everyone. I know a lot of people that have gotten out to nature in the, during the pandemic that didn't do that before. I know people that have purchased bikes and ridden hundreds of miles in the time that they now have available, since they're not driving to work and they're staying at home working. So I think the more infrastructure we can build that keeps people as local as possible. So one example I'll use is a new development gets built. We need to look at creating trails within it that connect to local amenities like grocery stores or banks or the dentist, instead of focusing on putting parks elsewhere, for example. And those linear corridors, whether they're Edison easements or trail right-of-ways, or I'm sorry, railroad right-of-ways that can be converted to trails, we need to look holistically at all of the possibilities. And I will also say there's been this very, again, siloed approach to development where a wall is erected around the shopping center. So a neighborhood next door may not be able to get into it and has to walk twice as far to get their groceries because there was no access point. And so we need to look at retrofitting some of these locations to make it easier for people to not hop in their cars.
Yeah, that's a fair point. As someone was revving at the mall behind me, behind my office, I had to mute myself so you guys didn't hear that. But you know, spot on, you know, Melanie, and you're right. Like you know, you build it, and they'll come, and then we also have to adapt to it. I remember, you know, living in Pasadena. I grew up in Pasadena, as mentioned in my bio, and the Holly Street Village apartments. Like I always, you know, you go to old Pasadena with my family, and then you're just like, why does this apartment built with like a giant hole in it? And you're just like, you know, you go back and forth, and it's like it makes no sense. And then sure enough, 10 years later, there's the gold line, right? And so when you talk about, you know, being adaptive or modifying or thinking forward, we gotta think that way. And if you create that opportunity, then good things can happen. It's kind of gonna wrap up the kind of set questions that I had, and then we'll go into the Q&A from the participants. So start with Manny. Manny, how do you know, and actually let me backtrack. So this kind of goes back to Melanie's opening question and answer to the and, right? So we've been talking a lot about different topics, but then the and is like a really, really important word, and it's a very strong word. We all know that and, you know, connects everything together. So Manny, how do you find the and to the housing, social justice, and environmental preservation question?
I think to me, from a policy standpoint, is letting it be an and not showcasing it as we're doing this, this, and this, versus we're improving the quality of life by having all three, and understanding that that is a quality of life and making that the norm. Because I think a lot of the times in some communities we say, well, we're doing this, we're championing for this, so this is going to make us better. But I mean, Melanie kept stating, you know, we work in silos, and I feel a lot of the times different communities champion certain things in silos and saying, well, this community is better because they have a robust public art program. This community is better because they have great parks. This community is better because, you know, they have housing stock or whatever. And it's more like, let's have it all. I know that's like very ideal and so forth, but we have to set the standard and push towards that. So I guess my answer would just be like, make it a norm. Let the and be the norm.
Melanie, what do you think?
Totally agree with Manny. We need to be creative and we need to be thoughtful. And I think one of the comments in the chat was, you know, using infill in a transportation efficient area is a conservation strategy. And so we need to look at how we're also framing these topics. It's not just trying to preserve land, it's trying to improve the quality of life or increase property values for the neighbors that live near that park, or reduce gentrification, you know, by coming up with policies and ways to implement programs that benefit everybody. So let's get rid of the silos, let's start creating policies that work for everyone, and let's invite everyone to the table, and let's listen to what the concerns are. And I think that's one of the reasons FHBP has been successful in its conservation work is that we find the alignments. Yes, we will disagree on some things, but when you find the alignments, you can get so much more done. So you spend a lot less time bickering on things.
Val, what do you think? What's the and?
I think the and is take chances. You know, we're all visual people. If we see a great project that a city has that addresses everything, then it just takes one. It takes one great example to be able to show, look, it can be done, right? And you know, laws and policies, they don't change within a day, but it takes one person to drive by a great project, a great development, and say to themselves, you know what? I changed my mind. It would be amazing to have this type of project in my neighborhood as well because it looks like it works. You know, oftentimes there's a lot of discussion back and forth, but I think ultimately everyone is extremely visual, and so if cities, decision makers, policy advocates, you know, are able to kind of advocate for a single project, take a chance on a single project, a single proposal that seems to be addressing everything, and really advocate for it, then that one example I think will lead to many more. We don't need to be able to have something set in stone that will proliferate thousands of great projects, thousands of great initiatives. We just need one to be a great example, and then I think the rest will follow.
That's great. Val, I'm gonna keep it on you, and I'm gonna go into the participants' questions. But you mentioned kind of, you know, the drive-by of that you know, that great project or great development where you're just like, huh, like that could work, and it did all these things where it, you know, the topics are, it was sustainable, it was sensitive to the environment, it provided transportation or linkage opportunities, and then it filled a need. What are some specific examples that maybe you've seen in and around Southern California of developments that have achieved those keys?
You know, I can just locally, there are new townhouses or row houses that are extremely kind of up against the public way on Harbor Street, kind of at the intersection of Garden Grove and Santa Ana, where every time I drive by, it's such a stark street. There are these news's where it's at the bottom, and then a residential on top, and then on the other side of the street, it's a large lot that is used for used cars. So it's almost like two different type of usage. One on one side of the street, it seems very inviting, where you have the storefront out in front. There seems to be a lot of circulation, a lot of pedestrians going back and forth in and out of these small businesses. And on the other side of the street, it doesn't seem like anyone want to walk past that portion of that parcel because there's nothing engaging them on the street. And you know, it doesn't need to be a kind of architecturally significant project. It's just something that you see that is just different from the norm. You know, I love driving around and seeing people on the street rather than driving around with just cars zooming passing by, and the street escape is just desolate. And so what, you know, that's what comes to my mind. It's just a more populated street frontage, which then when you drive by, you see your community, you see the people that you live with out and about with their day, and it just makes you feel more part of your community.
Awesome. What about you, Manny? What are some projects that stand out, that deliver it all?
Unfortunately, I can't say that I know projects where they deliver it all, because most of the times I always see, oh, this project has great design, or oh, this project has affordability, or this. But yeah, they don't have it all. And a lot of the times it's just because of negotiations, or when you end up going with developers, they're like, we'll give you this, but you have to get rid of this or this because of the bottom line. And it's never, hey, let me try to give you all, but it might not be the density or whatever it might be. And unfortunately, I haven't seen it where, where we have it all. And I think that's where we need to be pushing for, because a lot of times in the negotiations, you're like, all right, give me this, but then, we'll scale back the design or whatnot. And, I'm always a big proponent for quality design, because I think quality design ultimately gives people community pride, a sense of ownership. And ultimately it's nice, like Bao said, you have people that are walking, you have people that want to be part of the community, and so forth. And I think that's the biggest downfall in affordable housing, that yeah, you'll get the units, but then you're going to get an end product that it's not high quality or something that's deserving of that community.
Manny, I'm gonna keep it with you because you brought up design and high quality, and I'm gonna extend that to high quality materials. How how has technology, by way of the construction industry, what are your views on that? So, a specific individual asked about modular construction for multifamily, which is intended to, cut costs and save time from a construction standpoint. Is that a technology that you think could still be a project that delivers it all, or do you see that there's some cons to that approach?
I mean, ultimately, I've seen it, and I grew up in construction with my dad and stuff like that, and I've seen just the construction industry change a lot. Buildings and stuff like that. I feel like buildings nowadays, construction materials and whatnot, they're more dispensable. And I don't know if that's intentional in the sense where they don't want the building to last as long. So then they're rebuilt and whatnot. And then I think part of it also, sustainability has to be tied in to those type of materials and stuff like that, because sometimes they do things cheaply because, oh, we just want the effect. Like, for example, foam trim. Back in the day, it used to be stone. It used to last forever. It gave it that hearthy look to the building itself. And then now we have this foam with like this, stucco over it. But then, as soon as you hit something with it, there goes that foam trim. And then the whole thing comes off and stuff like that. So, it's just kind of looking, usually, I mean, I would say probably using sustainability as the groundwork, and then how we're shaping and how the building industry is moving. Because I think a lot of it's just driven by consumerism and, hey, what's the bottom line? How can we get more out of it, versus looking at what the ultimate goal is.
Mr. Architect, Mr. Bao, what are your thoughts on construction technology, and maybe touch on, modular construction?
I think there's been a lot of progress done in modular design. I've seen it done a lot in Southeast Asia with large scale development in rural areas where infrastructure has not been in place. And so, I had the opportunity to work in a rural town in Vietnam where infrastructure was not in place, but the developer had a vision of large multi-acre townhouses to really kind of bring people to that specific region. And so they wanted to explore modular design because they felt like that there's a cost saving to that construction method, and so I see that there's a valid point to advocate for modular design, but then a lot of the projects that I'm working on now, a lot of times contractors are stuck in their own ways. They know 2x4s, their crews know 2x4s, and to really, it's like a tug of war where you see great technology, especially in the building industry, progress in the magazines and in these very highlighted projects. But at the end of the day, the projects that you end up working on, there's a there's some pushback, because I think a lot of times certain builders are set in their ways. They know what works, they know what's profitable, and they know that certain materials, certain tools, certain methods still deliver, and it still delivers the bottom line. So it's really hard to advocate for a change in methodology when that methodology, if you can't prove that the methodology helps the bottom line. And so I think the burden is on us to provide proof, provide data that it would deviate from kind of standard operating procedures, that it doesn't affect the bottom line. And I think as long as it doesn't affect the bottom line, I think there will be more people on board.
Yes, you mentioned a project when you were talking about kind of that rural area of Southeast Asia and how it lacked infrastructure, but yet they were looking to kind of densify that area. Melanie, do you think that increasing residential density is reliant on adequate transportation or infrastructure?
Yes. I mean, simply put. And, kind of tying it back to the policy component, I'm hoping most people in this session as attendees know that the Southern California Association of Governments has allocated its regional housing needs assessment across the counties and across the cities. And so cities are responding right now by updating their housing elements. And this is your chance to participate and talk about density and infrastructure and all of the things that tie into planning for a city. And so if you're not already involved in that, get involved. Meetings are being held. I know lots of cities throughout Orange County are working on where do we put those houses. And I do think residents, and this may come back to kind of the NIMBY component that was talked about earlier, folks that don't like density, if you can point to the general plan and say, but when we listened to you before, you said you wanted density here. So what has changed? And I think the expectation on the residents' side is that if the general plan is the rule book for development, then the expectation is that the city will follow it. So, because if you have listened to your community and you have set your vision and goals, those are important tools for the community and for developers or commercial entities, et cetera, to rely on for what could possibly be done in a specific geography. So I kind of veered away from your density, but I do think it ties to the housing and general plan. And I think all of the components that we've talked about with, complete streets, making sure that we have sidewalks in our neighborhoods, or retrofitting neighborhoods with sidewalks so that people can walk safely around instead of having to share the road with, I'll say nicely, distracted drivers, whether it's distracted by a cell phone or the radio or kids. So there's a lot of action that needs to be taken still.
Well, I mean, keep it on you. You talked about a couple of things that was interesting. So you talked about obviously policy, and you talked about SCAG specifically for our area, and allocating what each city or county has to provide from units. What's your take on micro or like tiny homes? And we're laughing because we talked about this. And does that make sense in Orange County? Does it make sense in every city in Orange County? What are your thoughts?
So I can't say it fits every city, but I think flexibility in the zoning code and the general plan are going to be essential to meeting our housing requirements. And there's a lot of, seniors, for example, that are downsizing from their single family residence, and they may not want to move directly into some senior community. And so if they have an option other than an apartment complex where they could do a micro unit, or maybe it's a micro unit that's in the backyard, it becomes an ADU. I think that offers flexibility we don't currently have. So I would be for it. And I'll also throw it out there since you brought it up, Jason. There are parking structures that remain empty. And I think Atlanta has a really good example of how you can reuse spaces. In that example, it's parking structures, but we could reuse buildings and have adaptive reuse policies that allow us to build housing in places that already have the infrastructure in place.
Awesome. Val, what do you, in full disclosure, I kind of already knew what Melanie was going to say. What's your opinion on tiny homes or micro units?
I mean, as a personal preference, I love the tiny house shows, tiny house nations. I think the ability for people to be so creative in such a small amount of space is incredible. In terms of micro units and tiny houses, I think that it's I think, like Melanie said, it's a community by community basis. I think if there is a need for it, then I think that that's something that should be discussed and something that should be zoned for. But then at the end of the day, I think as we discussed before, it might become a generational issue where particularly college graduates, they might not need that 1,600 square foot house because there's an upkeep. There's so much that's involved in a single family house that that's more than just purchasing it. And so maybe smaller units, more denser units, more appropriate size living space. I've always been an advocate of spaces that are appropriate to the usage. So I think traditionally we have this post-war mentality, war, like suburban mentality, that we all need that single family house. But sometimes different lifestyles and different family sizes, they deviate from the normal kind of living situation. And so I think to be conscious that not everyone needs a single family house and not everyone could take care of a single family house. I think when we incorporate that type of thinking into our policy making, then it opens us up more to the possibility that micro housing, micro units, because it's done all over the world. Japan having such a low land mass, the population has grown to live in smaller places, smaller living conditions. But their cities, their countries still thriving, and so I don't think it's something that can't be done. I think it's just more in terms of if there's a need for it and if there's a cultural acceptance of downsizing. I mean, people always joke that when people think of Southern California, think of McMansions, right? Yeah, you have a couple with two kids and they're living in a 24,000 square foot house. But culture change, mindset changes, and as people, as the population of homeowners change, I think the mindset will change. And if there's more housing stock on the market that challenges the idea that you need to have a single family house to grow your family, then eventually, I think the mindset will change, and then not everyone will need to have their own backyard, front yard, things like that, or not everyone will need a 2-car garage. I think this is more of education, and then knowing that culture changes, culture revolves, and so what we see now might not be what would be kind of palatable to the future generation of OC or residents.
Manny, what do you think? Micro units, tiny homes, fits?
Yeah.
Think it fits in Orange County?
I just think we need to have more options in order to have a higher probability of solving the housing crisis. And I think part of all of these options is just bringing a new forefront to Orange County, and how, like Bao and Melanie both stated, is just kind of changing the lifestyle, so to speak, or just introducing different lifestyles that are not the norm in Orange County. And, you know, we can't change, we can't grow if we don't try something. You know, and like Melanie said, yeah, it's not going to fit in all the cities, but at least, hey, wherever it does fit, let's see it as a case study, so to speak, and then, you know, let's see it grow and see what happens. I mean, all we can do is try.
Right, right. And I'll add my 2 cents, even though I'm not a panelist, but I do think the diversity in the different types of housing products is literally crucial and a critical component of everything that we're talking about. Because if we don't have that spectrum, if you will, of population, then there is going to be no change, because everyone exactly, you know, they want, you know, the same thing. And so it's collectively common interest, which then leads to NIMBY, you know, and how do you introduce, you know, something new? And it's just this whole kind of cycle, if you will. But I'm all for, you know, diversifying residential product types in cities and counties.
Can I add something to that, Jason?
Yeah, go ahead.
So back to my comment on silos, we can't just add micro units and not look at the entire community. We need to make sure that if we're building houses in locations that people don't need to rely on cars, that we have access to those amenities, that we're not just thinking in that silo of, well, this is a housing option. We need to think about it on the human scale. And I think Bao pointed that out in the Santa Ana options. And there are a couple projects by the train station that I think fit that example really well in Santa Ana. So.
Yeah, awesome. So this question, it's a lot of questions in one question. So I'm gonna try to condense it a little bit, but it kind of leads back to one of our leading questions in this discussion, was about engagement and early engagement. And so this individual is asking, you know, how do you incentivize or enforce or penalize people, let's just call them developers, so that they are genuine and forthcoming in a genuine outreach approach rather than a required outreach approach. And you know, going to something that Manny said about just checking the box and putting it on some obscure website that nobody can get to, or it's not optimized for you know, best usage. Manny, what do you think about that?
From a city standpoint, as far as giving incentives, I mean, obviously you have to kind of craft the policies a little better, and you know, you're not playing favoritism and stuff like that and whatnot. But I think in any community, you gotta have your to-go project that you're gonna really work at, you know, with a special developer or someone that's really vested in the community. I think a lot of the times you gotta shop around, you gotta date for that developer that is genuinely interested in the community, is ingrained in the community. And I think once you have that one ideal project or that superstar project that you can start pointing to have more developers, hey, follow the lead of this worked, and so forth. Because then at that point, once you have you know, there are developers out there that are genuine, that they want the community, they want this, they want that, and they want to be engaged. It's just you have to kind of finding that right fit, and then having them kind of take off, and then after that, being able to point to those projects and tell the developers, hey, look at that project that worked out, this and this, and then from there, that's what sets the standard. I know personally that's kind of how I've worked in the past, being able to point to things, because not only that, but from the community standpoint, it's a lot easier to say, like Val mentioned, hey, look at that project. It has, you know, walkability. It has, you know, great architecture or whatnot. And then it's more tangible for the community when they can say, oh, okay, I can see this or I can see that. and stuff like that. And it's working towards that superstar project in your community.
Melanie, what are your thoughts on that?
So I don't know how to incentivize it, but that just could be my lack of knowledge. But I think it needs to be ingrained in the process. And I don't know, again, lack of knowledge, if it can be legally enforced, but I can tell you the more successful projects I have seen are the ones that come to the community early and say, here's what we're proposing. Tell us what your early thoughts are. And if nothing changes between that meeting and the EIR, there's no benefit to having that early meeting. So I think the experience of the developer can play into this. And I'll point to a friend of mine who also happens to be a planning commissioner in Dana Point, Eric Nelson, who works for True Mark Development. And he's got this wonderful story that I'm not going to even try to recount word for word kind of thing, but there was a project, people were upset when it went to the planning commission, and he said, oh my God, I had no idea. And that literally changed not only the project, but the company's approach in how it moves projects forward in other communities, that you get the community engaged. I think the key, though, is to make sure that when you are having those invitations for a conversation, that isn't back to the just checking a box thing, that there's actually a substantive discussion about the concerns and a conversation about how those concerns can be addressed.
One thing just to add that I have seen in the past, and then when talking to developers and kind of spinning the whole community outreach is, I always stress it's a form of marketing for the project, both through the approval process, but more importantly, like once it's up for market and people start buying units or leasing or whatever. So, I always tell developers, you have to understand your brand and what you're trying to get across and start that early. And that's part of the development process. And, you have to be genuine and what are your goals out of this project and how that's going to fit into the community. So I think once you have the developer and kind of the city on the same page as far as how it's going to move forward, you really get the buy-in from the developer because they see the benefit where it's not just, hey, I'm just doing this because I have to.
Yeah, and I've given some advice to that effect to the developer about, hey, it's in your best interest to do X, Y, and Z, and try to come in with a concept, but not with a cooked project, and still know what it is that your objectives are, right? So again, it's a balance and what that developer's objectives are. But there's ways that you can do things. And I tell people all the time, you can look at two buildings and they could be side by side, and one can be 100 units and one can be 50 units. And you would have no idea that they're different, and taking heed to design and angles and massing and all these different things are like super, super important. And a lot of times, to Bao's point, it's education. So you just gotta, just keep educating. And I feel like the engagement and outreach is more of it's a class, right? So you're just educating. But since you're all commissioners, Bao, I'm gonna throw this one at you, and this is gonna be our last question. This person is saying that most city councils and planning commissioners in Orange County are resistant or afraid of housing or projects that are 5 or 6 stories tall. And I can tell you right now, like, I'm on the 3rd story, and I can see clear to Anaheim with no building obstructions whatsoever. And so, I tend to agree that there in Orange County has not been a lot of verticality. Bao, what are some examples of some attractive 5, 6, 7-story housing projects that you've seen?
I think the general development along the High Line. Are we talking specific to Orange County? Or?
Yeah. Well, maybe it's not Orange County. Maybe it's somewhere that someone listening in could probably go see. We'll call it Southern California, maybe. Or actually, Google exists, so just any project.
Well, I think it's that's very hard. The funny thing is it's hard because I think we've kept the height restrictions pretty to this a pretty strong hand to keeping the height restriction down. But I think there are two 10, 12-story condos that around the South Coast Plaza area, where although there's not anything specifically unique about them, but they were built around a large water feature, which if you drive past the freeway, you wouldn't know, but on the ground floor as a pedestrian, I think it's an enjoyable experience, right? So visually, some might say it's an eyesore because it's not compatible with the existing kind of built up around it, and that I see that there's merit to it, but the give and take there is that of course it's built up and it's the first of its type, and someone has to go first, right? In order for us to like all the other discussions that we have had before in terms of housing stock, housing type of specific zoning, someone has to go first. And of course, the first one is always going to stick out like a sore thumb. But then again, in terms of architecture, you build with your context, and so if your context is all low rise, then you tend to build within your context. But then if someone takes a chance, policymakers, decision makers, someone took a chance to do a 12-story building, then the first building might look out of place, but then that opens the door that gives the context for others to follow, and then it starts to become a norm. Then it starts to become visually kind of acceptable because you don't think of it as an eyesore anymore. And so for me, there's nothing specific great that comes to my mind, but I think that what's great is there's certain projects that's able to put that first step in order to open the doors for other projects.
Yeah, I'll throw this out there again because as a Pasadena native, and actually was a planner in Pasadena, but I think Pasadena does a good job of respecting the old and the historic. And so if you actually go to their city center, all those buildings around it are 5, 6 stories, 7 stories, but they're respectful of the city hall that was built in the early 1900s, and they use plazas and placemaking open space areas to highlight their library or the civic auditorium. And so you get these like visual kind of Disneyland effects, and you don't really focus on, oh my gosh, on the other side of me there's a 7, 8-story building. And so that context and focal point, I feel like is a really important feature, and being respectful, also to the bones that you already have is really important. Melanie, your thoughts?
So the examples that I've come up with, so I'm thankful Bao went first, gave me time to think of some. I haven't spent much time in the projects, but certainly driving by them and going, ooh, I like that. There's a couple in Anaheim on Harbor Boulevard, and I do think it comes back to kind of what you were pointing out, the context, being aware and sensitive to what's around you. Of course, there's a lot of palm trees, but not making it look like a boring, flat-faced apartment. But I want to tie it back to affordability, that I want to make sure that we are all thinking about the fact that a lot of luxury apartments are being created right now, and we really need affordable locations that are still high quality, but that's going to be important for our community members. And if we're trying to meet our housing laws and our environmental laws and being equitable, we can't just build, the luxury apartments along major streets. I do also want to say that I can't think of a whole lot of examples other than stuff kind of along the 55 that's kind of tall. But I think that could be a reflection of the values of the community. Going back to that general plan and having that set the standard for an area. And I think there's appropriate locations for density in apartments and multi-stories, but I think it wouldn't fit on a ridgeline in Brea because that's not something that Brea values. We want it in the city center, and we want it, near our transportation corridors. So it is very community specific.
What about you, Manny? Your last comment.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's very important. You need to have that balance in how we're growing. Especially when it comes to 5-6 story buildings and so forth, especially in Orange County, because like Jason said, there's not that many. I mean, you can look out and so forth. So whatever is going to come eventually, we have to be very cognizant that our design, our scale, cake layering effect, all that is taken into consideration. Because even here in La Habra, I've seen some townhomes that are just 3 stories and people are already like, oh my god, but if you have good mitigation factors that are roped into the actual design aspect of it, then you're going to get the highest and best out of it, and then people are going to be more comfortable with it. Because we only have one shot, and then if we get 5-story building, it's horrible. There's no cake layering, there's no scale looked at on the sidewalk side, then people are gonna be like, oh no, if that's what we have to look forward to in density, we don't want it. So I think it's very important to be, especially in Orange County, is and kind of pushing on the design aspect, is being very cognizant and put that one of the issues that should be most important, because we're going into new territory.
Right.
I just wanted to add, Friends of Harbors, Beaches and Parks has also done a couple of toolkits related to policy. So I'm going to put those in the chat if folks want to look at them. One of them is a Healthy Communities toolkit. So it gives specific examples of where those wins between potentially divergent groups have been found, and then a general plan resource directory where every general plan in the county was gone through to pull out good policies related to transportation, water quality, administrative stuff, the environment, etc. So just providing additional resources if folks want those.
Awesome, thanks, Melanie. So Ms. Elizabeth, back to you. I think we're good. Great dialogue, guys.
Excellent dialogue. Yeah, thank you so much. This was a real treat. I actually feel like I maybe fell down a little on my fielding the questions in the Q&A in the chat, because I was listening and with rapture. I'm also a planning commissioner and a housing advocate, so it certainly had me captured. So I appreciate your time. And again, I wanted to say thank you to the audience, for those of you that are still with us, and to our audience on Facebook. This was our first attempt at reaching out beyond the Zoom world to invite social media in to the types of conversations that we at People for Housing Orange County have. I want to thank Melanie and the Friends of Harbors, Beaches and Parks, and the OC Policy group that does Planning Commissioner Education. They all were co-hosts, and I'm really looking forward to where this can go. I hope that if you are interested in this type of dialogue, if you're interested in this type of conversation, we will do this again. We will do it with a different set of voices, probably some architects and some folks in the development world. I'd like to do one with that group of folks. But it's always good to know what your decision makers, what your policymakers are thinking. These are the people in our community that have stepped up and volunteered to be sort of the community eyes and ears of development, and to keep the balance between, what fits in your community, and also though complying with what we know are state laws, which is we have a housing shortage. There's no question. California is struggling with a homelessness crisis. And that is the direct result of the fact that we just have not built enough housing. And so that's why People for Housing Orange County is the advocacy organization one of many, but we are the Yes in My Backyard YIMBY organization for Orange County. And so if you are interested in knowing more about us, you can go to our website. It's peopleforhousing.org. You can join, you can sign up for our mailing list. You can follow us on Facebook or on Instagram. We are at OC YIMBY on Instagram, and on Facebook and Twitter, we are at, Housing OC, I forgot. Melanie, do you want to put a shout out to your social media handles?
If you go to the FHBP website, fhbp.org, all of our handles are there.
Okay,
Keep it
great.
simple.
Okay, awesome. All right, I want to say thank you to the panelists and to Jason, our moderator. Putting this together was a real treat for me. There's so much talent in this county, and I know that as the power shifts down the ladder, FAHB is Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks, is what that stands for. I know that as the generations shift, right, and you guys were talking about this, about generational change, and how does the millennial and the Gen Z folks look at life and experience things differently than, say, like the boomers and the Gen Xers, right? And I'm a Gen Xer, so I can say I'm kind of straddling the generations. I'm excited for the thinking that's going on in this county, and I'm excited for as we see more younger, Gen X millennials, stepping into positions of leadership and stepping into positions of power, that it will shift and that we will create more sustainable, equitable, and inclusive communities. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you and good night.